what we are trying is that, can the child complete education, if not regular, through the NIOS, which is the National Open School? Can the child be put into some kind of a skilling program? So we recently had a tie-up with, say, Khadi Village Industries, where short-term courses were introduced for such children, and very interesting programs like even bakery unit or hair cutting or plumbing, and so different mobile repair. As far as Anganwadi services are concerned, see, they're catering to huge numbers, and they're catering to such regions where you would not think that any government scheme or services were actually reaching. So your goal has to be that what is the kind of change which you want to bring, and then look upon these as instruments which are your enabling instruments to say, and then work towards it with a passion and commitment.
It is a privilege to welcome Mrs. Rashmi Singh, Secretary to the Department of Women and Child Development in the Government of Delhi, amidst us today. So, ma'am, my first question, because since you helm the affairs related to women and child development in Delhi, according to you, how can we as the youth of this country contribute to the cause?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for making me a part of this business conclave of SRCC, where I've come earlier, but every time I see the enthusiasm growing, and it's youth who are bringing this enthusiasm. And I think one way in which you can actually contribute is by bringing, your full spirit and enthusiasm to the development process. Because the kind of process of growth and development that we are in, that really needs, full spirited, wholehearted participation of youth, without which the kind of future that we envision, और विकसित भारत की जो हमारी पूरी संरचना है, तो वो पूरी संरचना जो विकसित भारत का जो हमारा गोल है, हमारा सतत प्रयास है, वो पूरा हो ही नहीं सकता जब तक आपकी पूरी भागीदारी, युवाओं की भागीदारी नहीं हो उसमें. तो आज जो मैं आप इस युवा फौज और फोर्स के साथ में बैठी हूँ, तो मुझे और आपका जो उत्साह देखा अंदर आते हुए, उस उत्साह से मुझे यही लग रहा था ये उत्साह कम देखने को मिलता है. और विशेषकर हम लोग जब अपने बड़ों के अडल्ट सर्कल में जब रहते हैं, तो उस अडल्ट सर्कल में मुझे ये एंथुजियाज़म वाकई में कम दिखता है. और आज की तारीख में हमारा सबसे बड़ा चैलेंज है ग्रोथ एंड डेवलपमेंट का, वो है स्पीड एंड स्केल दोनों. तो वो स्पीड एंड स्केल जो है, इसका क्या मतलब हुआ? It's not only we say Viksit Bharat 2047, but every day is important, right? So the speed of change matters. The speed of transformation matters. When I say scale, what matters is, are we able to reach every pocket in terms of, geography, in terms of bridging the rural-urban divide, in terms of bridging the people's divide, in terms of bridging the gender divide. Now, how do we do that unless there is full-fledged, wholehearted, spirited participation of all, but more the youth, because of the kind of energy which all of you have. You have age in your favor. You have, I think, also exposure in your favor. You have a lot of contemporary opportunities which are thrown your way in your favor, which probably many did not have earlier. With the kind of opportunities of access to technology, AI conclave is going on with all the global leaders here. And how much India also, has in its favor to be able to use these, for better opportunities. So that's it for now, and thank you.
So actually, ma'am, the distinguishing that you gave between scale and speed, often we get stuck between binaries, that we can either achieve scale or speed, but Viksit Bharat definitely requires both of them simultaneously in cohesion, and that's what you shed light on. Now my next question is about child labor, because on 3rd of February this month only, the District Child Protection Unit of your department rescued 21 children who were subject to child labor in Azadpur. Now, we often hear this in news that these many children have been rescued. But what happens after they are rescued? How do you ensure their rehabilitation? Do you send them to their families, or what is the process thereafter?
First of all, I must compliment you for having seen this particular news. And this shows that you, as a youth, are engaged with contemporary realities around and the developments around, and that too in a sector which not many people willingly engage in. So my compliments to you. And the other thing is that how do we do that in terms of making sure that the rehabilitation, restoration, reintegration into the society happens in the manner in which it should? It is challenging indeed, because see, in something like child labor, now often we have seen that it is the families who are sending the child out to work for adding to their economic security, for augmenting the income of the household, or maybe they want to depend totally on the whatever income that the child is able to earn, because of joblessness within the family, because of no assets, no resources to fall back on within the family. So it becomes like I would say, many a times they would, try and show that it is a necessity, to have the child sent out for work. But the question is that when we look at these kinds of cases and when we, rescue the children, we are seeing a particular act, the mandate, and making sure first that we have the interest of the child kept before anything else. Whatever the family has to say. So first of all, it is like child labor cannot be, permitted at all, whatever the excuse the family is giving up with. The reason may actually some reason may sound convincing, yet you cannot allow that. So let us first be very clear that we are all a part of, this owe it as a civic responsibility to ensure that the acts, whether the prohibition of, child labor or child marriage, or say the POXO Act, or the Dowry Prohibition Act, or the Act for Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace, we all know about it, and Act has to be implemented in letter and spirit. Now in this case, you move beyond it. Why? Because prevent to kar liya, rescue kar liya, what happens thereafter, as you said. So here, see how a system responses. In every district, you have a district child protection unit. In that unit, you have district child protection officer, you have counselors, you have, outreach workers, and you also have in every district a child welfare committee. Now, normally, the child welfare committee decides what is to be done in the best interest of the child. Now, the child welfare committee decides whether the child is to be sent to a childcare institution or sent home, to the parents, to the same set of parents, or like the single parent or the guardian. So that call is taken. If they feel that the family setup is not conducive enough to be able to raise the child, to be able to give education to the child, and the family setup is going to again say that we are dependent upon the child, then the child welfare committee doesn't allow that family to own the child. So we as state become guardians of the child, because the child is then going to stay in a childcare institution where they have not just shelter, not just food, but good education. Also, we look at the ways in which the aftercare program can also be factored. That when the child turns 18, suppose the child is growing up in a home, so the child turns 18, so vocational training, placement linkages. And we also now have something called a mental health unit, because we know that every child, whether away from the family, would require some kind of a counseling support. So whereas like we have dedicated counselors, clinical psychologists, but nowadays, at least on my part, I try and like convince everybody who's around the child that you have to have some counseling skill also. All of us need to have that. So that's how we respond to the best interest of the child. So you would have heard this phrase called CNCP, child. Now what's that? A child in need of care and protection. And where does, all this mandate of taking care of such children come from? It's a JJ Act, the Juvenile Justice Act. So on the one hand, I'm talking about prevention of certain things which now are illegal, but at the same time promotive. So promotive are certain enabling mechanisms. So those are covered under the Juvenile Justice Act. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, because most of the times we misinterpret this, that after a child has been rescued, he's sent to their parents. But since you told that the post-rescue efforts are as important as pre-rescue efforts, so those were very important insights for us today. And since you also talked about the Juvenile Justice Act, this is something that is also been going on around in the debates these days. So the Juvenile Justice Act gives a framework for reformative justice in the country. But should the safeguards that are given in this act be applicable even in the case of heinous crimes, if the child has committed the heinous crimes, or should we develop some other framework, for example, fixing the accountability with the parents, or should any other framework be developed in case of heinous crimes with respect to Juvenile Justice Act?
See, in terms of framework, again, as I said, children in need of care and protection, even for the other set of children who are defined as CCL, which is children in conflict with law. So the framework is the same, that they have to be dealt, under Juvenile Justice Act. For them, we have like special homes. We have observation homes. Observation homes, now they are meant for those children who are under 18 while the trial is going on. You see, while the trial is on, you are there in an observation home. But once the offense is proved, then the same set of children, they are supposed to be in a special home. And if the crime is heinous, offense is heinous, we have place of safety. However, under the Juvenile Justice Act, the basic principles still remain the same, that the child does not have to be treated as a criminal. So it's, how you treat the child who has committed an offense, while the child was under 18. And while the trial is going on, they can actually stay in a home till they are 21. Beyond that, we cannot keep. But till 21, we can keep, if the trial started before he was 18. So when I say principles are the same, now here our approach is more towards reformation. Our approach is not punitive and punishing the child. That's not what, as a Department of Women and Child, we are meant for. As a Department of Women and Child, we are looking at the child's vulnerability. We are looking at the circumstances in which the child, made that offense. We are looking at the social fabric in which that child was staying. उसको पढ़ने का मौका नहीं मिला, अच्छी शिक्षा का मौका नहीं मिला, शायद वो vulnerable, into different kind of addictions, whether drug and other kinds of substance abuse. So we look at those, reasons. क्यों इसकी मानसिक हालत ऐसे हुई? आसान नहीं है. छोटे छोटे बच्चों का जिस तरह का ऑफेंस के साथ वो आते हैं, तो उसके पूरे सर्कमस्टांसेस को देखते हुए उसमें एक इंडिविजुअल केयर प्लान बनता है. हर बच्चे का एक इंडिविजुअल केयर प्लान. उस इंडिविजुअल केयर प्लान में जब तक वो बच्चा हमारे साथ में रहता है, तो सबकी ड्यूटी हो जाती है, वेदर आर केयर टेकर और वेलफेयर ऑफिसर और सुपरिंटेंडेंट और काउंसलर्स, they have to, but the child in this case, children in need of, the CCL category, they have to be produced before a juvenile justice board, JJB जिसको कहते हैं. हर district में there's a JJB, Juvenile Justice Board, under the JJ Act. So once the child is produced, they decide now whether the child is going to stay in our special home, observation home, or to be sent out, to be released, sent back to the family, or to be released on bail, So they decide in the best interest, again, of the child. Yeah, that how the reform is going to take place. And suppose they are sent back to the family, then they'll put some conditions also. And here again, what we are trying is that, yeah, can the child complete education, if not regular, through the NIOS, which is the National Open School? Can the child be put into some kind of a skilling program? So we recently had a tie-up with, say, Khadi Village Industries, where short-term courses were introduced for such children, and very interesting programs like even bakery unit or hair cutting or plumbing, and so different mobile repair. So all these are, and we also started something called like radio inside, where they can talk about, and all children can hear. Somebody can be a good singer, somebody is a good painter. So different kinds of art expressions, that is also encouraged. So therapies go on, yeah. Because our attempt is that once you step out of this particular home, then you should be a changed person and not again looking back to the old life where you felt that, there's nobody there for you. So we have to stand by. And I think I'm in this forum where, when I say we, it's not just the government, that you as youth also stand by to understand why such offenses are taking place, those circumstances, and how you can help and how you can reach out. Thank you.
Ma'am, because oftentimes when we hear such news that this juvenile has committed a crime, we get emotionally charged and pass on comments. But since you shared this perspective that in the Juvenile Justice Act, the justice part is as important as the juvenile part, and that justice should not be punitive but reformative in nature. So that was definitely a valuable insight. Now, you briefly mentioned a civil society organization in your answer. I would request you to elaborate on that and how these civil society organizations play a decisive role in the public policy. And if you could share some personal anecdote as well.
So when you say civil society organizations, you would probably mean, even individuals, civil society as a whole. So there can be, see, when you talk about organizations, normally what comes into your mind is registered entity like NGO. But at the same time, there can be, forums, maybe just youth advocacy group. So, who are able to bring about greater awareness about issues. So like the way I'm talking to you. So bringing out greater awareness that if, a crime has been committed, offense has been committed. And so in terms of the public policy, I think the role of civil society has been very important into shaping the way public policy has come up for children, for child rights. Where the child is like not made to feel like a criminal, but a child is like, being seen as somebody who's still valued for like his potential role. So till 18, kya circumstances, kaise hua hai, so whether the child was deprived of education, why? Who was responsible? Was the system responsible? Was the family responsible? Yeah, so you go into all those factors. So the very fact that the policy has been influenced by not only bringing this philosophy of understanding how to situate a child, but the other way the policy has been influenced is creating mechanisms to be able to implement the act on ground. Because when we say Juvenile Justice Act, suppose we did not have the mechanisms. So like the child welfare committees or the district child protection units, which you find nation over, not just Delhi, but go to any district, you'll find these mechanisms. Now, how did these mechanisms come up? Need for a counselor, need for, say, sponsorship amount. So now you have like sponsorship amount of, say, 4,000 rupees, which can be given to a child under Mission Vatsal, which is the flagship scheme meant for children in need of care and protection. It can be given even if a child is staying in a home, family setup. So family setup, if the child or the family setup is seen to be vulnerable. But a district child protection unit, they will submit a report. They will submit a report to the Child Welfare Committee, which will issue an order. So, I have actually seen this sector grow over last few decades. where you created room to see that, okay, all kinds of institutional and non-institutional mechanisms got strengthened. You might have heard about foster care. So, adoption, of course, you would have heard of. That mechanisms for how do you facilitate adoption also, so that a child who's orphan, who doesn't have in the home, while we welcome the child to grow up. But ultimately, if the child is able to get a home where he or she is adopted, we also encourage that. So those are called non-institutional care, foster care, sponsorship care. So those have grown over the period as by way of, greater involvement of different civil society groups, people who care for children. And I would say it's not cast in stone ever, because these things keep evolving. So that's how I feel that, youth like you have to question that what's happening to that child, and what is the best way of, making sure that the linkage with institutional mechanisms which are there, what are the institutional mechanisms which are there? You should question yourself. You should familiarize yourself. So that way you are in a much better position to help a child in need. Thank you.
Definitely, ma'am. You rightly mentioned that the non-institutional factors definitely aid the institutional factors in the implementation of program. And one program particularly, which has remained at the intersection of both women and child development, are the Anganwadi workers, right? So most of us might have benefited from their services, but we often do not know the details of or how useful this program has been for the women and child development in India. So can you please shed some light on that?
So I'm really glad that you spoke about this, because as far as Anganwadi services are concerned, see, they're catering to huge numbers. And they're catering to such regions where you would not think that any government scheme or services were actually, reaching. In my experience, say, when I went to Andaman and Nicobar Island, served there for more than 2 years. So the remotest of islands, where probably it was a challenge to see what's finally reaching the last mile. I saw that there was an Anganwadi there. Or I had the privilege of actually starting new Anganwadis in such remote locations also. So one is the flexibility that you have, because it's on need basis, it's on demand basis, and it's based on actual count of the number of families which are there, say over 1,000 people, or a mini Anganwadi for even smaller numbers. So we can open Anganwadis on demand. Of course, there are procedures involved that you have to get it duly sanctioned. And in hilly terrains, say Jammu and Kashmir, again, when I visited many of the remote locations, there were Anganwadis. Now, what kind of services do they actually afford? And why is it important today? Very important for all of us to understand. Because you might have heard of this critical importance of 1,000 days of a child, importance in terms of the brain development in that initial 1,000 days. Around 80% of the brain is getting developed. Till the time that a child becomes 6 years old, more than 90% of the brain development is happening. Now, what affects that kind of a brain development? Right from the time that the child is there in the womb of the mother, to the time that the child is born, the initial immunizations, the nutrition, the breastfeeding, or the mother to be able to receive the antenatal, postnatal care. So Anganwadi actually looks at these kinds of services. It may not be true for the privileged class. Why? Because we are, in any case, we are paying and getting these services through even private sector, facilities which are there. But I'm talking about a class, which would otherwise probably have neglected these things. So Anganwadi today, is looking at nutrition, is looking at early childhood care and development. And early childhood care and development has become such an important foundational pillar for making sure that the child grows into a healthy, through a life cycle approach. जब बच्चा स्कूल जाता है वो हेल्दी है, अडल्ट के रूप में वो हेल्दी है, तो all that is getting actually influenced from the kind of care which is happening. The cognitive skills, they are being developed through Anganwadis. So Anganwadi functionaries actually are doing a yeoman's work, I would say, for taking care of such children and mothers, at a very critical stage of lives. And I take this opportunity to ask all of you that why don't you all actually, start adopting Anganwadis, getting linked to your nearby Anganwadis, maybe as teams. And while I'm here in Delhi, I would seriously encourage this kind of a structural linkage, synergy, which you can have to actually understand what's happening, at that level and how youth engagement can help. And I want to just add that this is something not just coming from me. In Niti Aayog, one of the meetings which recently happened, which was chaired by the Honorable Prime Minister of India, one of the first sessions was on the role of Anganwadi services and on how we can strengthen. And you'll be happy to know that it came from no less than the Prime Minister himself when he said that why not youth, start getting engaged more actively. Students, universities, colleges, why can't children start, actually celebrating their birthdays in Anganwadis? So developing that emotional tie-up. And by the way, I actually spent my birthday this year, which was in January, going to Anganwadi with cakes and gifts for the children. Thank you.
So now that is definitely my plan for my next birthday, because we never thought that even the Honorable Prime Minister would be so interested in something that most of us don't even know the name of, right? So Anganwadi is one such scheme. Now we've covered in a holistic manner the child development programs. And now let's move on to the women development program. And one particular scheme in Delhi, which has been, has its pros and cons, is the free bus yatra to the women of Delhi. Because on one side, there are proponents who say that it increases the mobility of women, economic mobility of women, whereas the other side says that it is against the concept of equality. So how do you see this, ma'am?
How can it be against the concept of equality? Because for me, equality is also like looking at equality in opportunity. And women, actually require that more of level playing field, in a way in which their work participation can be enhanced much beyond the current level. So when you say there are differential policies involved, those differentials, if done for bringing a level playing field, actually are not creating an unequal or unfair practice, but it is more of, as a directive principles of the Constitution would actually look at providing, more of, there are proactive measures, which you do to enable greater gender equality in the society. So the greater gender equality, when you look at the various indicators, one of the indicators which strikes is lesser women work participation. So why is that happening? So you need to bring about such policies, right? And these measures like, free ride in buses. So these are way by which women often, looking for better opportunities and stopped by the family that you can't explore, because probably even to explore for better opportunities, it costs. So at least that kind of, policy measure by which the family feels that, the government or, the ecosystem around is supporting women's participation, which is very, very important if we have to have a balanced growth and development. Because for any kind of balanced growth and development, you need full participation of women in different walks of life, which I'm glad that today all states, most of the states at least, they are having these, positive measures, enabling mechanisms to encourage better participation. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, because your answer says that we cannot achieve all-round economic development without the participation of 50% of our workforce. So definitely such schemes are necessary. And now my last question to you is actually a request, because many of our audience members, and myself included, here are UPSC aspirants, right? And most of us want to go into public policy, directly or indirectly. We need to understand public policy. So what would be your parting message to the audience members and everybody who's hearing you to understand the policy measures, and how do we look at the government policy measures that are being introduced, especially in the digital era right now?
Okay, so one is that have a better engagement, I would say, with the policies which affect everybody, on a day-to-day basis. So not just a futuristic vision, but today in terms of the policies for, we talked about women and children. Yeah, so what are these policies and why? So the moment you start getting engaged into it, then you become a more conscious citizen. And the moment you become more conscious citizen, I think you that awareness, that awareness level, which is there for you to actually start thinking about your role as a public servant, which I think is the first step to crack any exam. Because the first step is that you have to, actually put yourself in that shoes. Because it's not the, end all. Cracking an exam, qualifying an examination is not an end by itself, it's only a beginning. So if we adopt that, as a goal, it's not good enough that we have cracked an exam. So your goal has to be that what is the kind of change which you want to bring? And then look upon these as instruments, which are your enabling instruments to say. And then work towards it with a passion and commitment. And जो कहते हैं कि नहीं वो तो सपने तो ऐसे ही हो जिनको देखे बगैर नींद नहीं आए, जो आपके पूर्व राष्ट्रपति जी ने ये बात कही थी, है ना, कि ऐसे सपने ऐसे नहीं हो जो कि सिर्फ नींद में आप देखें, लेकिन ऐसे हो जिनको देखे बगैर नींद नहीं आए. तो वैसी कुछ बात जहाँ पे आपके सपने ऐसे हों कि लेकिन उस सपने में हमने एग्ज़ाम के लिए पढ़ाई की, हमने एग्ज़ाम को कम्पीट कर दिया, वैसे सपने नहीं हो. क्या बदलाव लाया, क्या बदलाव ला सकते हैं, क्या बदलाव लाने की ज़रूरत है, मतलब क्या करने की समाज में ज़रूरत है. तो मेरे लिए जो पूरी पब्लिक सर्विस की परिभाषा है, जिसको हम हिंदी में लोक सेवा की परिभाषा कहते हैं, वो परिभाषा यही है कि हम क्या कर सकते हैं, क्या बदलाव ला सकते हैं. थैंक यू.
With these words, we come to an end of this enlightening session. And ma'am, personally for me, this was like an interaction with the role model. So thank you so much, ma'am.